Hi everyone, Danny here from the Community Broadcasting Association of Australia, welcoming you to today's webinar, Better Together, Volunteering and Community Broadcasting. Before we get started, this webinar is being broadcast to you live from Gadigal land, and we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, that of the Gadigal people. We pay respects to elders past and present. Please feel free to get on into the chat and shout out the traditional owners of the land from which you're joining us on. It is National Volunteer Week. Congratulations, everyone. Thank you so much for all the contributions you make as volunteers to the community broadcasting sector. National Volunteer Week is Australia's largest annual celebration of volunteering, and as such, the CBAA is proud to welcome from Volunteering Australia their Chief Executive Officer, Mark Pearce, who's going to be leading today's session. 16th to the 22nd of May 2022 is National Volunteering Week. We'll be doing a whole bunch of stuff on our CBAA social media to acknowledge all of the volunteers that make this sector great. Please feel free to do the same at your station. That's what we're here to talk about today, to get volunteers there engaged and continually involved in community broadcasting. It's because we wouldn't be able to do it without our volunteers. They are the fuel that powers the engine that is community broadcasting. Volunteer growth is trending upwards. This is a pre-COVID statistic, but we're expecting to bounce back hard, seeing as we're all coming back after the pandemic. But we had 22,222 volunteers there in the sector. So I love a number like that. It makes it very easy to remember. Better than saying more than 20,000 volunteers in the sector. As stated, today's webinar will be presented by Mark Pearce, the CEO of Volunteering Australia, and we thank him and everyone else there at Volunteering Australia for making themselves available to be part of today's session. We know that obviously it's probably the busiest week of the year for them. Today's webinar will look at building your volunteer base, what makes people want to volunteer, valuing existing volunteers, and that means letting your volunteers who are there at your station know how important they are to all broadcast operations and also the community. And volunteering in a post-pandemic world, rebuilding a positive volunteering environment in a changed world. Now, I'm going to stop my share there. I'm going to give the camera to Mark. On behalf of everyone at the CBAA, thank you so much for making yourself available. The floor is yours.
Indeed, a pleasure, and it's great to be with you this morning, on National Volunteer Week. So happy National Volunteer Week to you all. Volunteering is critical to both this discussion and broadly to community life. And when we talk about community life, I would like to acknowledge the fact that I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal country, and I would like to pay my respects to traditional custodians, past, present, and emerging. And whenever I talk about our, I suppose, obligations, our connection to our communities, and within the context of an acknowledgement of country, I like to reflect upon the fact that what we term volunteering, that is broadly community participation, has been taking place on this continent for over 60,000 years. This is not a new concept. It's not something which, as a function of formalised and institutional structures, we're doing anew. We are part of a long continuum of community participation, and we might use the term of volunteering with all of the structures that sit around that. But community participation has been taking place here for a long, long time. We're very aware of that at Volunteering Australia and see that as both a learning opportunity, but also something of a template to consider engaging within community, the success of community over a very long period, and the fact that ultimately it comes back to people being innovative in how they live within community, identifying problems, developing solutions, and implementing those solutions collectively, collaboratively, working together for stronger and more inclusive, more resilient communities. So my respects are paid to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, to any First Nations people on this call today. I extend my respects, and to any First Nations people globally, I extend those respects as well. So, National Volunteer Week, it's an opportunity for us all to stop for a moment and celebrate the extraordinary contribution that volunteers make to our way of life each and every day. And you certainly see that through the work that you do. And I congratulate you on your pre-pandemic number of 22,222 and the fact that it's grown over the past 10 years. That has gone against the trend of volunteering elsewhere. Volunteering elsewhere has seen that we've seen declines. And if you think about some of the numbers, I'll oftentimes be one to talk about numbers. I come from a financial markets background, institutional funds management and corporate banking and investment banking. And so I'll talk a lot about numbers, and numbers tell a story, but they don't tell the whole story. And that's an important thing, but they do paint a picture and they do provide some context. So in around about 2011, around about 36% of Australians volunteered their time through organisations and into community. Just prior to the pandemic, that had dropped to about 29%. And of course, then the pandemic came along and we saw a precipitous fall in volunteering rates as a consequence of that. In fact, during the height of the lockdowns, 2 in every 3 volunteers stopped volunteering altogether. That's an extraordinary statistic. It also tells an extraordinary tale story of the fact that communities in general, through all areas of volunteer participation, lacked the contribution of volunteers. So all of those things that volunteers bring to making our communities worthwhile and livable and inclusive and enjoyable, 2 in every 3 volunteers stopped volunteering altogether. Of course, numbers have picked up since then, but we're still around the sort of mid-20 mark. 24, 25% of Australians volunteer their time through organisations. We've got a lot of work to do in terms of bringing numbers in, providing opportunities for people to volunteer within their areas of interest and obviously within their areas of life, both at a demographic as well as an age-based and interest-based level. And it's part of what we're going to be talking about today. Danny asked me to talk for about a half an hour on these 3 topics, and I'm not one to take people slide by slide and point by point, but I'm keen to cover off on those 3 topics and think about them in a more overarching fashion. And this is how we go about our work, how we engage volunteers, the conversations that we have, the programs that we've established and how they work, how we can make them more effective, more efficient for our own organisations, how to make them more enjoyable for the volunteers themselves, and ultimately to ensure that the communities that we all serve are better served by our actions, our activities, our volunteering, and the way that our organisations work. So we're going to talk a little bit about building the volunteer base. We're going to talk about valuing existing volunteers, and then we're going to look forward and talk a little bit about volunteering in a post-pandemic world. I suppose a good place to start is around who volunteers. And volunteers come in all shapes and sizes and from every age cohort. But of course, there are some commonalities around that. And in terms of some of the demographics, what we see is that it tends to be essentially the normalized distribution, the bell curve, where the majority of volunteers tend to fit within some certain well understood areas and cohorts. We know that in general, people with higher rates of education volunteer more. People with higher incomes volunteer more. People with better social connections and better social resources volunteer more. And those things probably make sense to us because ultimately within our otherwise busy lives, and all of us have busy lives with multiple and oftentimes competing requirements and demands upon our time, we need to find both the resources as well as the time to allocate towards our chosen volunteering activity. And certainly within the context of CBAA, that's well defined. And there's a range of things that the volunteers will do within your own organisations, and you as volunteers will do also. But the ability for us to be able to resource, service, and continue our volunteering does mean that we tend to see that volunteers fit into those 4 well-shaped cohorts. One of the challenges that we all face as people involved in volunteering is to provide opportunities not just for those cohorts, but for all Australians, far more broadly, to think innovatively about volunteering and our programs, to think innovatively about who we talk to and what we talk about in terms of the programs that we exist within. And of course, I'm talking about volunteering in a very institutional sense, and volunteering occurs both in a formal as well as an informal way. And again, it's interesting to think about the numbers that sit around that. Around about 5 million Australians volunteer their time through organisations and into community each and every year. About 6.5 million Australians will volunteer their time informally into community. And there is a trend that we're seeing emerge, which is a preference towards more informal ways of volunteering. And one of the challenges, and I suppose opportunities for us, especially within the context and perhaps the constraint of institutional organisations, is to think about how we think about our programs and how we make opportunities available to volunteers so that we can meet some of their expectations. And I suppose we'll talk a little bit about those expectations and what they mean, and how we can provide better for them. Ultimately, more volunteers is better than less volunteers. Community is well served by more volunteers and better community participation. We know from data and from evidence, both domestically as well as internationally, that communities which are strong and resilient are the ones with higher rates of community participation, and volunteering is part of that community participation framework. I pulled out a piece which I think is worthy as we talk about some of these key themes that we want to cover off on today. And it says here that social capital theory suggests that volunteering is a mechanism for building trust in social networks, and an outcome of social networks in itself. And that's an important piece to consider as we chat today, because inevitably we need to look at the motivation of volunteers. And we're looking at how we attract and maintain and reward volunteers and what volunteering looks like going forward. And I spend a lot of my time talking about the fact that we can put some very meaningful, important, and useful frameworks around all of this. We can talk in complex terms about the nature of volunteering and how we engage volunteers and provide them opportunities to participate. But in many ways, it's pretty simple. And that is, we need to connect people's motivation to our own mission. And if we can do that and we can articulate that, and talking with an organisation like CBAA and all of its members, you're very good at articulating things. You're well versed in telling stories. And the story that we all need to tell, not just CBAA, but Volunteering Australia and all organisations who rely so heavily upon volunteer involvement, is to tell a compelling story which matches, meets, and amplifies people's motivation. It can be quite as simple as that. Matching motivation to mission ensures that we are better able to attract, to retain, and to reward volunteers. There's a lot more that goes into it than that. But as I say, I spent a lot of time within various public fora and community engagement opportunities talking about the need to match motivation to mission. And so what are people's motivations? What attracts them to volunteering? There are lots and lots of answers to that particular question. And of course, for each of us, it will vary. Everyone sitting on this call today and anyone who may otherwise be listening to this, and of course, the conversations that you have, as well as your own experience, will further underline and iterate the fact that each of us have quite different motivations towards our volunteering. But again, they can be grouped, and it's worth talking about those just briefly. And that's to say that when we rank them, the first thing that comes up, and it kind of comes back to this issue around motivation, is to say that values alignment is the thing that most frequently gets top billing when we speak with volunteers, when we engage with volunteers through surveys, or when we conduct formal research. The top motivator is a values alignment. Does the value of the organisation match with the value of the volunteer? And how do you articulate that, and how do you make that real? The second one sits around skill development. And of course, again, talking with members of CBAA, this is something that will be close to your own hearts. That takes a lot of skill. It takes confidence. It takes networks. It takes the experience gained from day one through a lifetime of engaging within community. Skill development is a big one. It's a big motivator. It's something that we know brings people to all sorts of different volunteering opportunities, but it's one that's certainly worthy of consideration as we think about our own volunteer workforces, and I use that term knowingly. We don't always think about volunteers as part of the workforce, but of course they are. They're an essential part of Australia's broader workforce. We tend to think about the workforce in terms of Australia's paid employees, but the workforce is paid employees and unpaid volunteers, both of whom work together in an inextricably tight relationship, which provides great outcomes for community. The third one that people tend to talk about a lot is personal growth. Again, you can see some linkage between these things. It may well be career-based. It may well be the fact that, hey, I want to give back to community. How often do we hear that when we talk to volunteers, and perhaps even when we're talking to people about our own volunteering? Why is it that you volunteer? Why do you take time out of your day that could well otherwise be allocated to something else? Well, it's because we want to give back to community. We want to make a meaningful contribution. We want to be able to see that the communities in which we live are better served, and through our own skills and our own motivations, we can do that. So that's a third one. The fourth one is career advancement. And so this talks to things like, for example, the skill development, network development, the opportunity to develop pathways to paid employment. A good example of that is years and years ago, I was working for the Australian Stock Exchange, and I used to do lots of radio reports each and every day. And one of those was to 4RPH in Queensland. And there was a young up-and-coming chap by the name of Spencer Housen, who was volunteering there. He's probably a name that you're familiar with through his more recent work with the ABC and others. And Spencer was a volunteer, and he was volunteering with 4RPH to build a career path. And clearly that's been really successful for him. I remember it well, and he was one of many people working for organisations like 4RPH who have said, hey, this is something I'm really interested in. It's something that I want to do within my life moving forward. If I'm able to do it in a paid role, great. If I'm able to continue to do it as a volunteer, that's fantastic too. But they're the four motivations that tend to see why people volunteer within their own chosen areas or fields of interest. So just running through those again really quickly: values alignment, skill development, personal growth, and career advancement and opportunity. And as we think about that point around what motivates volunteers, how do we engage volunteers, how do we retain volunteers, always matching the motivation to our mission is critically important. Understanding why people come to volunteering and come to our own organisations is an important piece. The other piece of research, which I think is worthy of mention, is that whilst we can spend an enormous amount of time on crafting clever messages and utilising various channels for advertising and recruiting volunteers, the thing that we know is most effective is word of mouth. And word of mouth is generated when people feel comfortable and happy and valued within the volunteering that they do. It's something that they take pride in. They see themselves reflected in the organisation with which they volunteer, through which they volunteer, and into the community they volunteer for. And so, advertising and crafting messages which go out through various channels is really important. Certainly some of those things that we've already talked about will influence those key themes. But inevitably, if we can create workplaces, it doesn't just have to be for paid employees, but volunteers as well. If we can create workplaces where people feel valued and they feel that they can see themselves within the organisation and the contribution that organisation makes to the community that it serves, so we attract more volunteers, so people feel that they are more connected with the organisation and are more inclined to be ongoing, long-term volunteers or employees of an organisation. There's a fascinating piece of research which matches a whole lot of drivers, motivators for volunteer involvement from the recruitment stage, becoming a volunteer, through benefits of volunteering, what do people say, other things that keep them coming back each and every day, and through to when a volunteer leaves an organisation. And there are lots of things that come into it, different things at different stages of the volunteer journey and the volunteer lifespan for an organisation, or more broadly for volunteering. The one that's consistent through every stage of the volunteer journey and volunteer experience is motivation. So I talk about this a lot, and I know I'm labouring this point, but it's such a critical thing. As I said, we can really overcomplicate things. We can talk a lot about various pieces of infrastructure to support volunteering, but inevitably, if we sit back, take a moment, think carefully about volunteers, look through the eyes of the volunteer to understand what it is that motivates them, what they're trying to achieve, what they're hoping for in terms of their volunteer experience. There's a term which talks about a psychological contract. Of course, if you're a paid employee, you have a physical employment contract. For volunteers, we don't have contracts. We are uncontracted. But we do have a contract which is called a psychological contract. And this is a really important piece because, again, it links back to these issues that we've already spoken about and the concept of motivation. But if you want to reward volunteers, if you want to maintain them, retain them, and reward them, understanding the psychological contract that you have with volunteers and you as a volunteer have with the organisation you volunteer through is an important concept, because it speaks to the implicit and perhaps explicit expectations from the organisation and from the volunteer themselves. And we know also from a lot of work we do in community, both domestically as well as the connections and the research we do internationally, we know that that probably maintaining volunteers takes more time than it takes with paid employees. There are less levers that we can pull with a volunteer to ensure that they remain engaged, that they remain committed, that their motivation stays high. There are fewer levers than there are with a paid employee. But I would contend that the levers that we have, fewer though they may be, are perhaps more powerful because they speak to the things which are fundamentally important to us as individuals. And when you understand that within the context of volunteering itself, you see that you strip away a lot of complexity. It comes back to this issue of, do I see myself reflected within the organisation I volunteer my time through? And if you do, and you have constant and ongoing conversations with volunteers within your organisation, you're able to ensure that that psychological contract that we spoke about is highlighted, it's acknowledged, it's valued, and you will see that retaining volunteers, and even when you come to this point around how do you reward volunteers, in most cases, volunteers aren't looking for their name up in lights, and they're not looking for awards, and they're not looking for those sorts of things. They're looking, the ultimate reflection of how successful we have been in terms of valuing and rewarding our volunteers is ensuring that they continue to see themselves reflected within the organisation that they volunteer their time for. So that psychological contract, not written, but clearly both explicitly as well as implicitly implied in the relationship from the organisation, from the volunteer themselves, is a really important piece. And I think we need to continue to remind ourselves of just how important that is, because when you do that, you remove the need for a whole lot of other extraneous reward mechanisms, incentive mechanisms. A lot of the academic research, and there is a lot of academic research which talks to volunteering motivation and incentives, ultimately leads back to the idea of self-identification within an organisation and the work that does. We also know that an organisation staying true to itself is really important. So we see a lot that organisations, through oftentimes environmental issues, they could be economic, they could be change within society and societal expectations. Those organisations will change, the mission will look different, and even the roles that the volunteers have perhaps for a long time undertaken and served alter. And when that happens, there's a real chance that volunteers will just leave. All of the incentives that you can bring, reward certificates and other things, won't mean anything if the people don't see themselves reflected within the organisation. And I suppose one of the things that you may well take away from this discussion this morning is the repetition in what I'm talking about. Matching motivation to mission is one of those things. For people to be able to see themselves reflected within the organisation is another. Understanding that explicit and implicit psychological contract is another piece. And it's part of the reason that I didn't want to necessarily go point for point through those 3 points, because I think that each one of those is reflected in these key themes. Certainly, as we start to look forward, and we're doing a lot of work and having a lot of conversations around what does tomorrow look like? What are the key drivers, the levers that are going to influence and shape our volunteering experience, our organisations as being reliant upon volunteers. We are engaged in the development of the national strategy for volunteering at present, and it's a big piece of work in a relatively short time frame. Not as well resourced as perhaps it could be, and that's something that I'm sure each and every one of you will that'll resonate with you as well. But the National Strategy for Volunteering is something of an aspirational process in that it's hoping to talk widely, broadly, with every part of the broader volunteering ecosystem to understand where the problems are, where the opportunities are, again, touch upon motivations, and then to try and provide a bit of a blueprint for volunteering for community participation for the next 10 years. And one of the things that we're going to be talking a lot about, and we have been talking about in terms of the consultation process and the engagement process that's gone to date, is this idea of what does tomorrow look like and all of the tomorrows to come. And hopefully that takes place in the context of post-pandemic. Of course, we continue to live with the impact of the pandemic, and I'm sure within your own organisations, you feel it. As I might have said at the beginning of the pandemic, when the lockdowns were at their most severe, 2 in every 3 volunteers stopped volunteering, and we saw that reflected in all parts of volunteering engagement and contribution. So the strategy that we're developing in concert with the broader volunteering ecosystem will address a post-pandemic world. And some of the things that we're starting to hear back from volunteers, volunteer managers, and the broader volunteering ecosystem is around this idea of flexibility and choice. One of the things that people and everyone's experience was different through the pandemic. And again, we see it in terms of fires and floods and all of those crisis and emergency periods. The pandemic is certainly part of that. One of the things that we hear consistently is that there is a desire, there's a motivation for more choice, more flexibility, for us to perhaps regain some of the agency that we lost during the pandemic lockdowns when they were at their worst. So programs moving forward need to be aware of that. The way that we think about the institutional structure of volunteering needs to be aware of that. The changing expectations from within community, and of course, volunteers are part of community, needs to be aware of that, or needs to be reflected within the strategy. And that speaks to this issue around, you know what, I lost so much opportunity to do the things that I wanted to do at the times I wanted to do them. The things that we're starting to hear back from the consultations are saying, we love who we volunteer through. We want to do more of it, but we also want to have a bit more choice in how we do it and when we do it and the types of roles that we're involved in. And as I said, when we started this conversation a good 20 minutes ago, is that it's really important for us in an ongoing sense as part of that psychological contract that exists between volunteers and volunteer involving organisations to ensure that people can see themselves reflected within the organisation and ensure that as their expectations change, as their circumstances change, and as those things that they want to gain from their volunteering experience changes, that our organisations and the programs that we operate and we provide are able to in some way facilitate that and ensure that people are able to continue along their volunteer journey, their volunteer process and experience in an unbroken sense within the organisation, but also to evolve as society changes itself. So another key takeaway, I suppose, is as we think about both our own volunteering experience and the volunteer experience more broadly within organisations, is to reconsider the programs, reconsider the way that we engage volunteers and provide opportunities for them to ensure that there is more flexibility, there is more choice, and there is the opportunity for people to regain some of that agency that they lost through the COVID period. We know that there's not an empathy deficit within community or within society. People are just looking for ways to get engaged and involved in ways that make sense to them as a function of their changed environment and their changed expectation. And as volunteer involving organisations, and certainly ones which are involved in being the voice of community and to community, you have an extraordinarily powerful position and opportunity to be able to shape that and provide a vehicle for that as well. And that's certainly not something that's lost on Volunteering Australia as we consider the breadth and the depth and the power of CBAA and all of its members, as I said, as the voice of and for community throughout Australia. You're part of this process, part of this ongoing change that's taking place within volunteering more broadly. You're an agent of change, and certainly within each of your own jurisdictions, you will gain and have access to a wealth of information and support through your own state and territory volunteer peak bodies, Victoria Volunteering Victoria, Queensland Volunteering Queensland, and so it goes. And I would certainly encourage each and every one of you to engage with those volunteer peak bodies as and when then the opportunity arises in terms of a better understanding your own programs and perhaps doing audits on those, considering how better to engage volunteers and some of the new thinking that comes through both from an academic as well as an experiential level around the volunteer incentives and motivations, and making sure that motivation is connected to mission. There's a lot of information and there's a lot of support for you. And of course, CBAA has been an extraordinarily innovative and successful organisation in providing, I'm sure, a lot of the supports that you need for volunteer programs. But I would encourage you also to look more broadly as well. I said I was going to speak for about 30 minutes or so, and I see that I've done pretty much that. I'm really keen to open it up, have a bit of a discussion, answer any questions that you may have, hear back from you about your own experiences, what you're seeing within your everyday lives and your professional lives within CBAA, those things that we hear back to the national peak that I lead are really critically important. None of those things are lost on us because ultimately we are about making sure that through the volunteer experience, communities are better served, communities are stronger. The theme for National Volunteer Week this year, as was mentioned earlier on, is better together. And we sincerely believe that through volunteering, we can make community better, we can make it stronger, we can make it more inclusive, and we can ensure that it meets our expectations and our aspirations moving forward.
Excellent, Mark. Thank you so much for that. Noel, who's watching today's session on Facebook, put forward, it's about supporting volunteers and both recognising and appreciating their unique, valuable skill sets. And I guess that reflects sort of what you're saying there about sort of now that we're coming back from a situation where a lot of volunteers had to leave the sector. No better time than now to sort of look about I believe your words were flexibility and agency.
Yes.
Choice there in regards to sort of the volunteering options that are available to people, and that's sort of something that we here at the CBAA discuss with stations a lot, because there's plenty of stuff to do there at a radio station. There's not just talking on air, there's all sorts of things that the station needs to be successful. So thanks to Noel and everyone who is connecting with us there via Facebook. Anyone who's here in the room with us now, you can feel free to let us know if there's anything that you want to bring up here on behalf of the chat, and also you can feel free to just keep things to yourself and raise it with the CBAA later on if you'd like. I know that you've got tons of stuff on here. The website is of course volunteeringaustralia.org, and just follow the links to find out all the other stuff going on here for National Volunteer Week. Is there anything else happening this week that you're particularly looking forward to, Mark?
Yeah, look, I think Danny, and I'll thank Noel for his comment, because one of the things that we can so frequently, and I'm guilty of this myself, we talk about volunteering as this amorphous mass, this collective experience, but of course we know that volunteering is profoundly personal. It's an individual thing. It's about individual relationships and our expectations and how we engage both with the organisations as well as our broader community. And that's done from the individual basis. And that message can oftentimes be lost. And as I said, I'm a bit guilty of doing that. As the leader of a national peak, from time to time, I can talk about these overarching numbers and strategic themes and all of those sorts of things. But Noel's point is really well made, and it's an important one to make, in that it's about understanding that volunteering is about individuals. It's about individual experience. And when we do that, again, this is a psychological contract. When we do that, we further look into identifying the things that motivate people. Now, why are you here? Why are you talking with me? What is it that you're wanting to achieve? And that conversation goes on and on. And so it's something that certainly shouldn't be lost on any of us, that the volunteering experience is extremely intimate and it's personal. And when we understand that and we live it within our own organisations and our own volunteering, we get so much more from it. National Volunteer Week is a very busy time for Volunteering Australia and all parts of the volunteering ecosystem. You just have to look on social media to see how many organisations, how many individuals are engaged in National Volunteer Week. And if it's everything from organisations, clapping and saying, thank you so much to all of our volunteers. We couldn't do it without you. And we know that that's so very true. There are about 1.3 million Australians employed by charities, and they are supported by 3.6 million volunteers for a lot of paid roles. Those roles necessarily wouldn't exist, or fewer of them would exist if it wasn't for volunteers. And organisations hopefully realise that, and they plan strategically for volunteers and the volunteer workforce as part of their overall workforce planning and strategic planning. The ones that do it are the ones that are most successful. During National Volunteer Week, we hopefully put out a message which both celebrates the role of the volunteer, the opportunity of the volunteer, the excitement that people feel, the fulfillment that people feel through volunteering. It's only a week of every 52. And of course, volunteering takes place every moment of every day in every part of Australia. And that's worth acknowledging. And again, as CEO of Volunteering Australia, I extend my thanks to all volunteers throughout this country. The country wouldn't exist in the way it does, and our communities wouldn't be as rich as they are without the contribution of volunteers. So in each and every state and territory, there are lots of events which take place, both within organisations and also by the state and territory peak bodies, to bring volunteers together, volunteer managers, to discuss current themes and emergent themes within volunteering, provide opportunity for connection, and also celebrate the individual contribution of volunteers. We, as a national peak, tend to do less on the event side and more on the organisation side for National Volunteer Week, and hopefully spread the message bit by bit throughout every part of Australia that if you're not volunteering, you perhaps should think about it. If you are volunteering, thank you so much, and talk to us all about how we can make it a better experience for you. If you're a volunteer involving organisation, there is a wealth of opportunity and information and support available to you to ensure that you don't carry this huge load on your shoulders all alone. There are lots in the same place with common and perhaps uncommon experiences who are more than happy to talk. So that's what National Volunteer Week is about. It's about events. It's about a celebration of volunteering. It's about articulating the value of volunteering more broadly. I'm oftentimes a bit stunned when I spend a lot of time at Parliament House walking the halls and talking with ministers as well as with opposition leaders and backbenchers and senators and staff and advisors, that everyone understands something about volunteering, but everyone's understanding is a little different from the next person. And maybe that's volunteering itself. Everyone's experience of volunteering is a bit different from the next person. But there's less understood about volunteering than there is understood about volunteering. And as a national peak, that's a real challenge for us, because we will say oftentimes to government, as we say to all parts of the volunteering ecosystem, there's a real need for us to be aware of the criticality, the centrality of volunteering and community participation. Because if it's not about community and our experience within community, then what is it about? And that's life in general. That's our economy, and that's the way our society operates. And that's all of the things, all of the infrastructure, government, corporate, philanthropic, and other that goes into supporting communities. It's one of the things that we're focusing on through the strategy, but it's hopefully something that we articulate with fervour and enthusiasm during National Volunteer Week.
Excellent. And I should also point out too, you don't just go to the Volunteering Australia website during National Volunteer Week, also head there at any other time. Yes. Resources and research, just two of the many wonderful functions that are available there. Now, I know I have to let you go soon, Mark, because it's a very busy week for you. Brief from FBI Radio was posted in the chat. We found during the lockdowns, we had a surplus of volunteers and a lot of ex-volunteers returning, so that's nice. But as things open up, our numbers are dropping off and we're finding engagement is very low. Volunteers are telling us they want more flexibility and the ability to work remotely, which is one of the things with community broadcasting that you're able to do. But they also want connection and a sense of community, and we're struggling to reconcile those two things because we're finding it harder to create a sense of community when people are remote.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating. The experience of CBAA and its members is in many ways, I mean, there's a lot of correlation with the broader volunteering ecosystem. But your experience is in many ways the polar opposite of a lot of parts of the volunteering ecosystem. So when lockdowns were at their greatest, 2 in every 3 volunteers stopped volunteering. And yet your experience is that volunteering rates and engagement increased. We're seeing that volunteers are starting broadly to come back to volunteering, and yet you're seeing it slip away. There are a lot of lessons that we can learn from CBAA and your own individual experiences. I guess the thing that we've seen as a common response and refrain from organisations that have done a really great job in continuing to engage and ensure that there is connection with volunteers is to ensure that there are avenues for that connection. And sometimes it's online, and sometimes it can be individual phone calls, or sometimes it can be small meetups, both with community, organised by an organisation. It might only have 1 or 2 people from an organisation there, but even that small thing brings a sense of community about it. The ability to be able to identify motivations, what are the things that motivate people, and then provide solutions for those people, those volunteers. If they're looking for community participation, there are lots of things that you can do which don't necessarily just fit into the work that you do at CBAA, but also in integrating and involving other organisations and other parts of community has been a way that we've seen in various parts of the country. Organisations have done really well, and even when they've been remote. So national organisations that have found it very difficult to maintain a one-on-one or one-to-many type of engagement have done it really well by engaging with other organisations and building a sense of community and continuity, even when there aren't a lot of people from that organisation there, because again, inevitably volunteering is about building community.
Mark, thank you so much for your time today. I'll just do one more comment from the floor. This one is from G-Man at 3K&D in Melbourne, Cool and Deadly, one of the always touted as one of the deadliest stations in the sector. He says that volunteers are priceless. And if I know G-Man, he'll probably let you use that if you needed a motto for Volunteer Week 2023, mate. Mark, thank you so much for joining us. As stated, if you want to find out more, just go to the website is volunteeringaustralia.org. We will keep the stories going all this week on the CBAA social media, celebrating our volunteers in the sector. On behalf of everyone here at the CBAA and of course our wonderful members and participants here in today's session, thank you so much for joining us today. Mark Pearce, CEO of Volunteering Australia.
Thanks, Danny. Thanks all.